I'm Chris Sims from ComicsAlliance.com, and this is Here's the Thing. And for this week's episode, Jocelyn, thank you, has informed me that a couple of you, including @Gavin4L, have asked, what's the deal with Firestorm? And I am very excited about that question, because it not only touches on a lot of things that I've written about and talked about on Here's the Thing in the past, but I also really just love Firestorm as a character. Like, I bought this t-shirt because Firestorm was on it. He's there in the back. And I saw this and thought, wow, when is the next time I'm going to see a t-shirt with Firestorm on it? Bought it immediately. Keep in mind, Hawkman is on this t-shirt too. That's how much I love Firestorm. Now, a few weeks ago on Ask Chris, I wrote about the sort of rise of the teenage superhero and how Spider-Man was a revolutionary character that really introduced the teenage superhero to the mainstream superhero audience in a way that has been copied ever since in several characters. Blue Beetle, the modern Blue Beetle, Nova, Speedball, Darkhawk, and one of the biggest ones, one of the most prominent ones, and probably one of the most successful ones was actually Firestorm. See, in the 70s, DC kind of realized that Marvel wasn't going away, and Marvel was doing really well, so DC tried to rearrange their universe to be a little more like Marvel. You get the more noirish, sort of serious Batman stories in that era, where Batman sort of becomes the modern-age Batman under Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams. Cary Bates and Elliot S. Maggin do some more modern takes on Superman stories. And of course, in 1971, the big one, they hire Jack Kirby, and Jack Kirby does the New Gods, and OMAC, and the Demon, and Sandman, and all that stuff that's, you know, obviously very Marvel-esque, because it's Jack Kirby. He's the guy who co-created the Marvel Universe. But they don't really stop there. In 1978, they get Jerry Conway. And Jerry Conway's a really interesting guy for them to go after, because he's, aside from like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, Jerry Conway at the time was about as Marvel Comics as you could get. He's the guy who takes over Spider-Man from Stan Lee. Now, as a quick side note, they also get Roy Thomas around this time, who is the second editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics after Stan Lee. And the reason they get Roy Thomas is because Roy has a really deep love of the Golden Age characters. Whether it's the Golden Age Marvel characters like the Invaders, whether it's the Golden Age DC characters like the Justice Society, that's the stuff that he really loves. And so he kind of revitalizes the Golden Age characters with the All-Star Squadron and ends up creating Infinity Inc. and kind of gets written out of a job in Crisis on Infinite Earths because the Golden Age characters go away. They are gone and kind of melded into the modern age characters. But getting back to Jerry Conway, obviously DC wanted their own Spider-Man type book. So they get the Spider-Man writer, you know, the guy who writes The Death of Gwen Stacy, the guy who writes the first appearance of the Punisher. And they basically get him and Al Milgrom in 1978 to create a version of Spider-Man for the DC Universe. And so you get Firestorm. But Firestorm's really weird. That's actually what I like about him. But he's complicated, and doesn't make a lot of sense, and there's a lot of weird stuff going on. He's really dark in a way. Here's what happens. There's this guy named Ronnie Raymond, which is a very Marvel Comics name. He's got that alliterative name. And he is a handsome young high school student who wants to go out with a girl, so he goes with her to protest a nuclear plant. Now, unfortunately for him, there's terrorists mixed in with the protesters who want to blow up the nuclear plant, and they cause this big nuclear explosion. Now, much like being bitten by a radioactive spider seems like it would kill you, getting caught in a nuclear explosion seems like it would kill you as well, but instead it just gives Ronnie superpowers. But not just Ronnie. See, there's a guy there named Professor Martin Stein, who's a physicist, and he and Ronnie get melded together by the blast, and they become Firestorm. They get a kind of different body that Ronnie's in control of, and Martin Stein's head just kind of floats off to the side, giving Ronnie advice. So they can only become Firestorm when they're together, and Firestorm becomes this two-in-one character who has conversations with this character that nobody else can see. Which is actually really funny when he joins up with the Justice League, because he'll be having conversations with Martin Stein, and everybody else is standing around, not knowing that Ronnie is 17, because he's in a big buff superhero body, going, what is going on with this kid? Who is he talking to? Now, there's a lot of weird stuff that goes with that. For one thing, at the beginning of the story, Martin Stein doesn't know that he's Firestorm. He just has blackouts. He knows that he's Firestorm when he's, floating behind Ronnie's body, giving advice. But when they separate, when they fission back to Ronnie Raymond and Martin Stein, Stein has no idea what he's been doing. He thinks he's an alcoholic, and he starts drinking more because he's trying to forget that he's having blackouts. And it's really weird, and Ronnie just kind of goes with that. The other thing that happens that's really weird is that Conway clearly tries to change up the formula a little bit, because he wants to do something a little different from Spider-Man. He makes Ronnie this handsome jock who gets bullied at school by a nerd. It's really weird. Like, what if Flash Thompson was the good guy and Peter Parker was this jerk, who eventually becomes a supervillain? Of course. Now, the original version of Firestorm didn't last very long. It's only 5 issues in 1978, but Firestorm started running his backup stories in The Flash, and before long, he comes back in 1982 as an ongoing series. And it's called The Fury of Firestorm, and later The Fury of Firestorm, The Nuclear Man, which apparently Conway didn't like. I've read interviews with him about this, where he talks about how he didn't like that title because he didn't want to write about Fury. He didn't want to write about a furious character. Firestorm was supposed to be a lighthearted, fun character for the DC Universe in the vein of Spider-Man, despite having storylines about Martin Stein thinking he was a blackout drunk. So eventually, Conway, and it is everything I can do to not call him Kanye right now. I want you to know the sacrifices that I'm making for this video. Eventually, Conway gets lured back to Marvel. They give him Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, which is his Spider-Man book for him to do whatever he wants with. And it's really cool how similar those books read, because Firestorm is trying to be a Marvel Comics book in the DC Universe, whereas Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man is essentially just everything Conway wanted to do with Spider-Man. So it's very fun. You get a lot of Villain of the Week supervillains in both titles, whether it's Multiplex in Firestorm or it's Swarm, the Nazi made of bees, the greatest villain of all time, over in Spectacular Spider-Man. So Firestorm sticks around, though. That second series, as much as the first one was kind of a flop when it came out, and to be fair, it actually wasn't a flop. It was a victim of the DC Implosion, where DC launched a ton of new titles and then realized they did not have the money to support those titles and canceled, I think, 11 or 12 of them at the same time. So it wasn't that it was a flop, it just didn't make the cut of the DC explosion turned implosion. But the second one goes on for a real long time. It runs for over 100 issues. And John Ostrander comes on in the mid-80s. And Ostrander, if you're familiar with what I've written, he's one of my favorite writers of the 80s. He writes Suicide Squad, which is maybe DC's best book at the time. And that's, going up against the Giffen to Mattias Justice League. That's going against all kinds of great stuff. Grant Morrison on Animal Man, Alan Moore on Swamp Thing. But speaking of Grant Morrison on Animal Man and Alan Moore on Swamp Thing, it's time once again for our favorite segment here on Here's the Thing, 1986, the year great comics ruined everything. Now, this isn't actually something that happens in 86, but it ties into all that stuff. Alan Moore was on Swamp Thing. This is before Watchmen, this is before Crisis on Infinite Earths. Alan Moore gets on Swamp Thing and does maybe the best run of his career. It's debatable, I know, but I really like Supreme a lot that he does later in the 90s, but Swamp Thing's pretty unassailable. It's a great long run, it's really good. And one of the things he does is he gets really cerebral and horror story with it. But he makes things complicated in a way that makes them really cool. Swamp Thing isn't just a swamp monster who can grow plants on his body. He becomes this sort of avatar of this thing called the Green, which is all the plant life in the world. And this becomes one of the most influential things to happen in DC Comics in the 80s. Because keep in mind, Swamp Thing's a DC book. Superman shows up, Lex Luthor shows up in it. That's as DC Universe as you can get. It's not reclassified as Vertigo until much later. But a lot of people want to recapture this idea. Like, Animal Man ends up being a avatar of the red, which is, to animals what the green is to plants. And a lot of people start becoming elemental forces. Like Swamp Thing's a plant elemental. Eventually Captain Atom becomes a quantum elemental in the Carrie Bates run on Captain Atom, where Death from Sandman shows up, which was apparently a big sticking point for Neil Gaiman for a while. But Firestorm becomes a fire elemental about halfway through the original run of Firestorm. Martin Stein goes away for a little bit, gets replaced with a Russian guy, and then I believe Martin Stein becomes the fire elemental and goes off into space, and then just gives Ronnie the powers. And then the 90s hit and a bunch of weird stuff happens with Firestorm. Ronnie Raymond becomes an underwear model for a little bit, and then Ronnie Raymond gets cancer because that's an adult storyline about radiation and what it does. And in the middle of all this, Ronnie Raymond's powers don't really make sense. Going back to the beginning, now the first thing that happens with Ronnie Raymond is that he's naked in the nuclear reactor with his head on fire. And again, that is one of the best looks a comic book character has ever had. If your head is on fire, there's like a 90% chance that I love you as a character. Ghost Rider, Firestorm, Dormammu, love those guys. Heads on fire, A+. But Ronnie looks around and realizes he's naked, and so he instantly creates a costume for himself, because he has this ability to restructure matter, which is why he needs Martin Stein, the physicist whose floating head is back here, telling him what matter he needs to restructure. Now, the cool thing about this is that it gives Ronnie one of the best costumes of the era. Seriously, a lot of people don't like Firestorm's costume, but I think it's great. He's got his head on fire, he's got this yellow and red suit, with an off-center logo that's kind of a stylized Atom. He's got these big poofy sleeves and gloves and this weird thing on his head, and his eyes look weird. And it's great. And one of the reasons it's great, Al Milgrom, someone asked him about that, and he said that he tried to design a costume that a teenager would think looked cool. And I think he does it, because it's such a weird, complicated costume, and it's great. But at the end of the day, you end up spending a lot of time, if you obsess over Firestorm, like me and my friend Scott did, trying to figure out why he has all these powers. Because he can restructure matter, he can shoot blasts of nuclear fire out of his hands. So what is that? And why does he have to fusion up with Martin Stein to do it? And what we kind of figured out was that Swamp Thing becomes Swamp Thing, like Alec Holland becomes Swamp Thing when he goes through this transformation. And all this is all laid out in the Alan Moore run, where Alec Holland goes into the swamp and things take over, and Alec Holland forms the blueprint of what becomes Swamp Thing. Like he's not Alec Holland, he's just built on Alec Holland's blueprint. There's a separation there that comes in the Alan Moore run. So he kind of figured out that that's what was going to happen with Ronnie Raymond, or with Martin Stein, actually. Martin Stein was supposed to be, become this fire elemental, which is what eventually happens in the John Ostrander run. So if he's going to become a fire elemental, why does he have the fusion and fission-based powers to restructure matter? Why isn't he just all fiery, like he eventually becomes when he's a fire elemental? And the conclusion that we came to is that those are Ronnie's powers. Ronnie's a metahuman. Ronnie has the metagene that gets activated in times of stress, because that's what happened in comics after the metagene was invented. Because Marvel had mutants. DC wanted to have something easy like that. So Ronnie's weird metahuman powers bond with Martin Stein's weird fire elemental powers, and you get Firestorm. It's very complicated and very weird, but it's fun to think about. Now, eventually, Ronnie Raymond goes away, and you get the second Firestorm, Jason Rush. And the deal with Jason is, it's essentially the same thing. Like the Firestorm Matrix, which is the sort of core of Firestorm's powers, seeks him out as a new host. And Jason gets the ability to bond with anyone. He has to have another person there, but two people need to join together to become Firestorm, but it can be anyone. And much like originally Martin Stein, they don't remember being Firestorm, which is really cool. And there's actually a really good issue where Martin Stein shows up, and he and Jason go inside the Firestorm Matrix and rebuild Firestorm's powers. Like, they literally have these, like Magic the Gathering looking symbols for all of the Firestorm powers, and they literally talk about rebuilding the character. And it's really, really cool. But, especially for a book where people are just sort of sitting around talking about a character. It's kind of like that issue of Justice League that Brad Meltzer wrote, you know, with all these guys, where he's talking about rebuilding the team, and they have photographs of all their friends. They're talking about it like they're building a D&D party. Except it's not stupid and terrible. Yeah, I went there. Deal with it, Brad Meltzer. Now, eventually, Blackest Night happens, Ronnie Raymond comes back, and Ronnie Raymond and Jason Roche become the new Firestorm. And that doesn't make any sense. Because first of all, Ronnie's back in college, and Ronnie was an adult. Like, Ronnie had a job. He was in the Justice League. He was in Extreme Justice for a while. Second is that, once again, Ronnie has the body. So, once again, you have Firestorm running around as a white dude with a invisible floating black guy behind him, which is a pretty harsh metaphor. But Firestorm goes into different media as well. He's on Brave and the Bold in an actually really cool form where it's, once again, it's Jason and Ronnie, but Ronnie's the gym coach at Jason's high school. And is sort of just this regrettable necessity for Jason to sort of bond with and become Firestorm. It's really fun. And I really like Firestorm a lot. I don't know if I would recommend actually sitting down and reading every issue of Firestorm like I did. I have this weird habit of doing that with characters like Punisher or Ghost Rider, or I tried it with Evil Ernie, and that was rough. But I did it with Firestorm too. And they're comics that are very much of their time. But he's still a pretty cool character with a lot of pretty cool powers. And he's well worth checking out. And maybe getting on a few more t-shirts that don't have Hawkman on them. That's it for another Here's the Thing. Thank you for watching, and if you'd like to tell me about your favorite parts of Firestorm, and maybe your theories on how Ronnie Raymond's powers work. No one has theories about how Ronnie Raymond's powers work. That's just me going to lunch with a guy who is equally obsessed with Firestorm and having nothing else to talk about. Please hit me up on Twitter at the ISB, leave a comment on comicsalliance.com, and I'll see you next week where I go into another history lesson about some weird, obscure comics thing from the 80s or 90s, because that's my area of expertise. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great night.